there's a lack of grace. There's a lack of respect for anyone that's different than you. So there's not hardly any love that you can share with other people that aren't like yourself. The only love you have to give are for people that are just like you, on the same journey as you, going to the same place as you in life.
So to start with, and this isn't a question that I think I've asked you directly. I sort of made an assumption, I think, because of how we got connected and knowing the website that you have and the work that you're doing. But are you comfortable sharing the name of the group that you were involved with? It's totally fine if you're not.
Yeah, it was called The Message. And those associated with it called it like the Message of the Hour is like the long-term name. But it was basically our prophet was named William Branham, and it was all his words that we followed, and his words became the message of the hour for the end time. It was like an end time doomsday kind of following, and that's how they came about having that name. Was the last message from God to us before the second coming of Christ.
So the hour, it's more of a kind of a symbolic term, but not too symbolic. I mean, they don't literally mean the hour, but they do mean imminent. Yeah, end time hour, like the 11th hour right before midnight and everything ends. Yeah, I think it's a good way to phrase that. Yeah, and I think something that is an important clarification for anyone who listens, who identifies as more of a mainstream Christian denomination. Mainstream Christianity in general does tend to believe that we're living in the end times, but not that we're in, like, definitely in our lifetime Jesus is going to come back. We're not counting on that, but we do believe we're in that bigger at large end time period that was discussed 2,000 years ago. So yeah, for anyone who's listening, if you hear end times, you might be thinking, well, yeah, I agree with that. This is more that belief of, no, it's going to happen, by next New Year's. It's going to happen soon.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just like growing up as kids, like, my husband never went to the eye doctor because he thought he was going to be healed, and why go to college because God's coming before you even can apply for college. Like, it could be happening at any second. And it was always, that's what you were constantly thinking about. Like, we're not going to make it to next year. It was always going to be this year. This is the year the Lord's coming is basically the theme around a lot of the services that we sat under.
And how does that impact you as a young woman, or your husband as a young man, looking to the future when those markers don't come to fruition?
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah. So when you're told, okay, this is going to happen by this date, or basically it's going to happen soon in general. So don't worry about a future. Don't make future goals. Don't plan for college. Don't plan for a career. Usually groups are saying still have children, which is interesting based on what scripture says. It's like, maybe you should be saying don't, because you don't want to put the kids through that. But how did that impact you as the world didn't end when you thought it would, and suddenly you had a life ahead of you and you had to do something with it?
I think my circumstances were a little different because I did go to college, and so very few did. But I think overall, just to answer your question, it's always worrying about the future, and you're never like in the moment. So you're just constantly thinking about how the world's going to end instead of living day by day. You're just thinking about the future, but not preparing for the future, if that makes any sense, because you're not thinking about putting away for retirement or making a better life for yourself or making plans just, financially and stuff like that. It's all based on how the world's going to end and getting yourself mentally prepared for that, but not preparing for the future in any other way.
Yeah, you're right. It's an interesting way of preparing for the future. It's not what our culture today would think. Absolutely.
So I know for me, I was probably in the 6th grade when I started to like hear all these rumors and things were preached by different preachers that came through on their evangelical circuit through our church, and talking about how the Holocaust was basically going to happen again for the believers of the message of the hour. And so they taught that someday we're going to all be rounded up based on what we believed and sent to concentration camps in Alaska. And these were just all rumors that were passed on, like the prophet said this was going to happen, but we didn't actually have a recording of him saying that. But then being in 6th grade and learning about the Holocaust and what the Jews went through, and then like, this is going to happen again. Like, how can I mentally prepare myself to be under this duress and to find myself in these different situations where I'm taken away from my home, separated from my family, and being persecuted physically for what I believe. And just like a child should never have to think about that or prepare for that. But that was some of the things that was going on in my head. I was constantly having to think about, just because constantly worrying about the future and how it was going to end. And yeah, I think at that point, that's when I developed a lot of anxiety, but didn't realize that's what it was, or it wasn't natural to think that way or healthy.
Right. And you were raised in the message. Do I have that correct?
Since the age of 5. Yep.
Okay. So you probably don't have much memory before it then.
No, we attended a Baptist church before then. I just remember, going to Sunday school. That was basically it. We just, since the age of 5, always attended a message church, and that's all I knew. And I believed it with all my heart. Like, I was completely, thought it was the truth.
Do you have any knowledge of how your family became involved?
Yes. So, strangely enough, a duo came knocking door to door in our neighborhood, 2 men, and they were witnessing door to door, and my parents happened to be home and invited them in the house, started kind of sharing, all about the prophet and just the new revelations that he offered about the Bible that most Christians are missing out on, and how you can have a closer relationship with God because of those revelations. And they met twice before deciding to start attending that church, which I think is so crazy, because we don't believe in door-to-door witnessing. Like, our church, I never heard of anyone actually witnessing to other people. Like, this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to go witness people. It's always about, you live your life of looking different and acting different. And then if they're interested, they'll ask you. Like, you don't approach them and share what we believe. You let them approach us. So to have that actually happen to my parents, where they were witnessed to, is completely, blows my mind. Is very much against the norms of what you would find in our church at the time.
And it would be the same for mine too. That's why my face is like, wow.
Yeah, I know.
Because certainly there are other groups that do that. And it's, what's funny to me is I've never really thought of it as being successful. Because there's, our culture in general jokes about it.
Sure.
They joke about, ringing the doorbell or knocking.
Yes.
But it obviously it must be successful, or no one would be doing it anymore. None of these, they would have all found another way to go and proselytize. So generally speaking, yes, it must be effective. But I would have to agree that my experience and the experience I've heard from others has been that it's not a very, go out and get them, go out and find them kind of group. It's more of a, let them come and God will bring them. Mm-hmm. So that is interesting.
Yeah. Even when I told that story, to my own, church members are like, that's so crazy. I can't believe that happened. So even they knew that was beyond the norm for them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow. From your perspective and your experience that you had, how would you describe the main tenets of the group?
And tenets, you're talking about like the beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have notes here. It's so hard to say this is what they believe because, as you know, each church was so different. Hundreds, thousands of churches, however many that number is across the world, but each church was allowed to be sovereign, is the term they used, so that the pastor could make changes and pick and choose what he wanted from the Bible, pick and choose what he wanted from the prophets. So each one was so different. But I think from my experience, some of the major beliefs was one, that our prophet was the end time prophet, the last word of God to this generation before the end of the world. And so some of the, I guess, beliefs that came from that, where he placed himself in scripture, was he believed he was Elijah reincarnated. He also taught that he was the seventh angel to the end time churches, which he took that out of Revelations, of course, out of context. And then he also taught that he was basically a second John the Baptist, that before the second coming of Christ, someone was needed to forerun the second coming of Christ by getting the world excited about Christ again, and to be able to accept the second coming of Christ. All that to say, by the end of his recorded messages, he pretty much had a theme that his voice was the literal voice of Jesus Christ and was part of the second coming of Christ. Therefore, there's so many churches that actually believe he was Jesus Christ on earth. And so I think that was one of the major beliefs, is just that he was so holy and so close to God that outside of Jesus, no one else on earth was ever that close-minded of God to be able to share those revelations that he later shared with us. So that was just like the number one thing to revere, was him as the most holy person he could ever come in contact with. And then I think other beliefs that were major.
Do you mind actually, if I pause you and ask a
Yeah.
follow-up on that piece? How did that actually look day to day in your life? How did that impact you, that he was this mouthpiece?
The first thing that comes to mind is basically like self-righteousness, like just knowing that you had the inside scoop to, God and what he wanted his people on earth to know before going to either heaven or hell. And just, I don't know how to rephrase that any differently than just the overwhelming sense of being more elite than other people, and just being constantly reminded, like, I'm the chosen one, no one else is chosen, and just that feeling of self-righteousness, like it was, and you don't realize that's what it is until you walk away from it. But you treat people differently, and you look at situations and scenarios, and just your whole outlook on life is so different because you see yourself as special and better than other people. And so I think there's a lack of grace, there's a lack of respect for anyone that's different than you. So there's not hardly any love that you can share with other people that aren't like yourself. The only love you have to give are for people that are just like you, on the same journey as you, going to the same place as you in life.
Yeah, I think you said that very well. And that mirrors a lot of experiences in different groups too. And something that I try to remember when I interact with someone who's still a part of a group such as this is the incredible depth of humility required to walk away.
Mm.
I mean, it really you have to be really willing to be bottomed out. It's hard. And I'd love for you to speak to that in a little bit when we get there. But I've had some friends I've spoken with in the past who have said, wow, was I humbled.
Yes.
Yeah. When you look back, I'm sorry, we can edit this part out, but was there something else you had wanted to say about I didn't want to cut you off if there's something else you wanted to bring up.
I think that was the main part, yeah.
Okay.
I think I touched on all of it, yeah.
Okay. Looking back, to really lock this in for people, though I think for many listening, it's pretty clear already. You've been sharing some really major points in the belief system. But looking back, if you were to summarize for people what made this unhealthy, how would you answer that?
I think outside of the fact that you see yourself as better than everyone else, as like the super elite Christian, aside from all of that, for me, the unhealthy part was that all of the benefits of the church, all of the I'm trying to see if I can word that better. I think all of the people who benefited the most from the religion are straight white men, which I know is a huge theme right now, just across the United States and different things. But with this religion, it was the men had all the rights, women did not have any rights. Men were seen as being designed in the image of God, but yet women were actually designed by Satan to tempt the men of God. So there was always this battle going on of women constantly trying to suppress their own natural tendencies just because it was seen as something to be scared of or something to avoid. Can you ask like another question around that? Maybe I can specify it.
It actually made me think of something. I certainly resonate with growing up having to try to hide femininity, but yet not being permitted to show any sort of tomboy masculinity either. So you're it's one of those like damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. That was really difficult. So it was always dressed very feminine, of course modest, but very feminine, always in skirts and long hair and things like that. But yet I have this, I can hear my mom's voice in my head of like, cover your hips. And I'm like, I mean, that's a task. I have hips. Like, what do you want me to do? And so even little messages like that, let alone the big overt messages, but even those little messages took a really long time. And honestly, I don't even know if they're fully out of my head in every way yet.
Yeah. That your body is somehow hated by God, but yet, I mean, you read the book of Genesis and God clearly created man and he clearly created woman, both in his image, and then later split them up. But yeah, the message is all about, the woman's form is something to be hidden and covered and something to be embarrassed about, I think, too. So that was, a huge thing. And then I think on top of that, like for me personally, it was all about forcing the woman to submit. And so because of that, men were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do to enforce that. So I know for me, like there was physical abuse in the home. There was mental and emotional abuse going on by my father. And it was encouraged. It was encouraged from across the pulpit. Brandon was known to be saying he said several times, that, you're welcome to beat your wife into submission. Beat her until she can't get out of bed, or your daughters if they disobey. He just encouraged the physical abuse so much that it was allowed. And there were situations way worse than mine, but we always knew it was going on, and yet you just turned a blind eye because it was encouraged in the church. And even masculinity was enforced. Like, you're not a true man of God unless your whole house is in submission. And so that encouraged men to do whatever it took to make sure their household lined up and the girls were doing the right thing and covering themselves in the right way and acting in the right way.
And that's a lot of pressure on the man too.
Mm-hmm.
I think of like my son who's 4, and I've had this thought lately because of some research I've been doing, some books I've been reading, and I've been thinking just his natural sweetness that he has, and how if I were still a part of this group, I would be trying to eradicate that right now. Like I would be trying to train a lot of the kindnesses and the sweet out of him. Now the whining needs to go anyway, but right now something that we're working with on him is how to express his emotions and have the language for them, and how to express them in ways that are healthy. And I've thought many times I would be telling him how to shut them down and how to just shut it down and do what he's supposed to do and make sure that everybody else does the same. Connected to him when he gets older. Those are very different messages. And it just breaks my heart to think of all the sweet young boys who loved their mamas, who had to go through that kind of indoctrination and training.
Sure. Yeah. If you're told this is how you treat a woman, and
yeah, it's heartbreaking. I don't know. Let me back this up. At what age did you exit the group?
I think when I turned 30. Okay. It was that year, 2015. I think for me, it was a good probably 1.5 to 2 years where I was like, there's something wrong here. Something's not adding up. But it took about 2 years to actually make that decision. Like, I am no longer going to that church. It was a very hard transition. I think the first thing I started questioning was simple enough, but it was hair. Like the whole doctrine around women cannot cut their hair. They can't even trim it, God forbid you give yourself bangs or cut off the dead ends, And so when I read the scripture for myself at about age 28, 29, like I realized when I studied the Bible, there was nothing that said you couldn't cut your hair. It just talked about the length of hair being the priority. But aside from all the doctrines around that, I just noticed that when I trimmed my hair just a little bit, people treated me differently. In the church, I was no longer seen as holy, and people would tap me on the shoulder, say, "We're praying for you," and just like walk away and was like, praying for me about what? Like, you're not interested in what I'm going through or have any like personal questions for me, just letting me know that you're looking down on me. I'm someone to be prayed for, and not actually have a conversation with me and get to know me and see what my thought process is, or even sit down with me to correct me. Like that wasn't even done. So that was a big thing. And then also the whole idea around men have the right to do everything, but one of the biggest things was men have the right to remarry in the church, but women cannot. So once a woman becomes divorced, that's it, unless her ex-husband somehow dies, then she's allowed to remarry. And so I came from my mom being a single mom since the age of like 8. So my mom was about 25 years old when she became a single mom and was forced to remain that way. Never have the hope of getting remarried or have a partner in life, as you get older. And so there was a situation over and over in several of our local churches where men were allowed to do whatever they wanted, allowed to remarry. And I just kept questioning, like, why is this happening? And I would read the scriptures about divorce and marriage, and I would read what the prophet said about divorce, and just things weren't adding up with the scripture. I just had so many questions. And when I went to my pastor about the questions I was having, he's like, this is not a question of what the Bible says. This is a question of your personal experience. And basically just told me that I was the one with the issue if I was questioning it. That was because of my experience that I was questioning the prophet, and that I should just put away those feelings and continue to believe, what was being taught. And I think I realized at that point that, that exceptions were being made for people that shouldn't have been, even based on our own religious beliefs, not even the Bible, about who was allowed to remarry. It was all based on how close you were to the pastor, because there were several instances of pastors' daughters being allowed to remarry, but no one else in the church, if you're a woman, was allowed to. And I just saw, I think, so much that was being taught wasn't being followed by the highest people in the organization, that I just knew something was off. Like, I knew the way people were treating me was not what I expected them to treat me, I think. And so realizing that now I was doing something a little bit different, I wasn't getting, I think now, let's see how I can rephrase that. I think just the changes that I made in my life when I started trimming my hair, I just didn't expect people to treat me the way they were. And so it just started a lot of questions. And from that point on, like, I just thought our local church was the one with the issue, so we'll try other churches. And we visited a few other churches, and it just was the same thing over and over. The same things were being preached. And I was just ready to throw in the towel for Christianity in general. But my husband was good about, like, hey, let's continue to find a good local church. And so we walked away from the message still thinking that the prophet was the prophet, just that we couldn't find a church that was preaching what the prophet said or what the Bible said. But once we actually got into a healthy church that wasn't associated at all with the message, we started finding that so many doctrines were misconstrued, and that we completely missed the whole idea of Christianity from our own experience in the message. So
through this whole process, up until this point where you just left off, up until where you're starting to realize, okay, this isn't actually matching Christianity. You've spoken to your view of other people and how they've been treated you, which I've experienced as well. And again, is very similar among different types of groups that are out there who are claiming some form of Christianity, but in truth aren't actually aligning with the real doctrine and the truth of who Christ is and what he's done for us, where the mentality is just do it and just shape up and just do what you're supposed to. It's not a culture of helping, of coming around someone and wanting to, like you said, oh, what's going on? Like how can we serve? How can we help? How can we be community to you? How can we be like family? It's, well, I'm going to pray that you fall in line. That's what they're praying for. And if you don't, then you're not really one of the chosen. And so, well, you never were to begin with, and now you're just living that out. So oftentimes there isn't a ton of effort to bring someone back either, which we can get to. I'd be curious to hear what your experience was for that. But through all of this, how were you viewing God and his expectations on your life and how he viewed you? What was your impression of God?
I view God completely different when I was in the Message versus, of course, when I left. And in the Message, it was, the best way to describe it would be like he was the Old Testament judgment God. Like you were under his thumb and you had to obey every single commandment that was in the Bible. And if you didn't, if you erred in one area, then, you could be condemned for it all. And like one example I can give is back when I was single, I was driving to church on a Wednesday night and this huge thunderstorm rolled in. And so there was lightning going on. It's raining like crazy. And I think like the day before that, I had trimmed my hair, probably for the first time like in my life. I trimmed it a little bit. So I'm driving on my way to church. It's Wednesday night. And I'm like so scared that if I get out of the car and my foot touches the ground of the church,
I know where this is going. Yes.
Like God will strike me with lightning as an example to all the other women in the church. Like I knew like if I stepped out of my car, God would strike with lightning. So I turned my car around and went home that day and just texted like people at church like, hey, I'm sick. I'm not going to be there because of course you're expected to be at church. So if you weren't there, they were going to ask. So like that was my view of God. Like he was there to pass judgment and to strike you with lightning if you missed, any of his commandments and didn't follow any of the rules. Like there was no compassion at all.
Which is very similar to the community of people.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
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 After you made that transition, well, first I'm curious because it doesn't sound like it was kind of this big dramatic we're leaving. You just sort of started checking out other places. Did it take a little time for people to catch on that you weren't attending anymore?
No, my husband was the worship leader.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it was quite obvious. And when I had trimmed my hair, that happened maybe 6 months before we left. And at that point, when I trimmed my hair, this is kind of like another segue here, but one of our beliefs in the church is if you trim your hair, your husband has the right to divorce you. So, of course, it's a huge deal, like if a woman's to cut her hair. So before I even thought about cutting it, after I read all the scriptures, like, I just really don't think it's here. Like, I sat down with Jeremy, my husband, and said, like, do you mind studying this with me? Because I don't think the Bible says you can't cut your hair at all. And so he was willing to do that. And he studied the Bible with me probably for a good week about the subject of hair. Even pulled up Branham quotes that even Branham said, like, hey, it's okay if your little girls want to cut their bangs. And he had pictures of his own daughters with cut hair. Like, this was never talked about, of course. And so he let me cut my hair. And then the pastor was just making off-comment remarks one time before service about who was allowed to come up and pray in between the services, like who in the congregation was holy enough to be selected to pray over the offering. And he's like, I don't want you to pick on these certain people in the church. You can only select from these few. And he was giving this advice to my husband, and my husband's like, well, I don't think you would want me to pray if you really knew everything that I believed. And this is, right after we started researching about hair. And at that point, my husband just realized I need to step down because I can't back up everything our pastor is saying at this point. So he stepped down from worship leading, and then coupled that with me trimming my hair, people started realizing there's something going on, that they're praying for us was the general consensus, after church when people would just pass by us. But I think to answer your question, we did one last meeting with our pastor the week before we stopped going to that church. And of course, women were allowed to go to that meeting. It was just the men. So my husband and a friend of his asked to talk to the pastor about some questions that they were having. And basically at that meeting, my husband's like, the pastor says, even if the Bible says something different than the prophet, you always go with what the prophet said, because he was the one that was closest to God and the last word we have from God. So that means the Bible is obsolete at that point, basically. And so that we always thought that was the absolute, the Bible. That's what we've always been taught. But now that we know that there's so much information out there about the prophet, and you can actually research his quotes and have this software to look in depth about the different teachings that he had, there's so many things that contradict each other. And now we are realizing that a lot of it doesn't line up with the Bible. And so just from the pastor saying that the Bible is no longer the absolute, my husband told him, like, we'll no longer be attending church. And then the pastor had no qualms about getting up the next service and basically excommunicating us. So telling the congregation, like, don't have any contact with these people. There were several sermons that were preached about us after we left, and they're all posted online so you could listen to them afterwards. But he basically told the congregation to no longer be friends with us, that, we were to be avoided at all costs.
Did everyone listen?
Yeah, I think everyone did. I had probably two older couples that reached out to us probably once after that point. But that was it. Yeah, that was the very end. So.
What about families? What about your mom?
My mom, when I shared our experience with how things were at that church when we left, she attended a sister church, so it wasn't the same one. And even she acknowledged, like, hey, that's not right. Like, they shouldn't have treated you that way. So I feel like maybe her church was a little bit more open to just being, I guess, more inclusive of people attending church, even if they didn't believe everything that was being taught. My mom had a few questions when we left, but then after she realized we weren't going back to the message church, she quit asking questions and didn't want to know anything, and told me that if I ever brought up anything about the prophet, that she would basically stop communication with me, that there would be issues. So that was kind of her threat.
Yeah, there's this strong, it's such a control thing. Just this control of information, really from the top down, but then even at the low levels, meaning just the layperson, sure, you and I, of controlling our own information that comes in. So like we perpetuate it, which I think is really, it makes sense based on the culture, but it's also really fascinating to think about. But I knew in my family, people didn't want information that they would then feel they had to do something with. So it was this form of protecting themselves from having to take action that maybe they didn't actually want to take. Sure. So it was, don't even tell me, because then, like your mom said, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I'm going to feel like I can't. So like, I don't even want to know. And so for anyone who's listening, who has experienced this, there can be a form of love behind that. As awful of a situation as it is, and as twisted as it all is, sometimes people don't want to know because they want to still be able to have you around.
Sure.
Have you been able to maintain that relationship
with my mom? Yeah. I mean, it's strained because we can't talk about anything of God. And I know for her, there's a lot of like depression from having to be forced into this life of loneliness by the church. And like, I know the easy fix for that is like, allow yourself the hope of having a partner to do life with. And she doesn't have that hope. She doesn't have that support system around her. This is her life. It's doomed. And so I think a lot of that dynamic just makes it hard for us to relate on a very personal level. Can't talk about life. You just got to talk about, we did the surface level stuff. We did this and that, and, what are you doing today? It's nothing that's a deep relationship building topic anymore. It's all very surface.
Yeah. The next question that I have is not on the list that I sent you. And so you are welcome to say pass if you want. I'm hoping it's not actually too personal. But seeing that you and your husband made the transition together and knowing what gender roles were like in the message, how has that experience been for the two of you?
That's a good question. We were very blessed in the very beginning when we left the church to find a healthy, community church to attend. And through that church, someone heard kind of our story and said, I want to meet with you both. And she was on the leadership team. So we sat down with her, not really knowing where she was wanting to go with that conversation. Turns out she was on staff as a counselor, but that her previous job was working for the FBI and profiling people leaving cults and cult leaders.
Wow.
And so she was able to sit us down and basically tell us, I know what you're going through, and be able to line up exactly our different feelings and be able to talk about, as you guys walk away from this, you're going to have to redefine your whole marriage. You're going to have to redefine yourself, but then also what life looks like with the two of you now, because it's going to be so different from what you were raised in. And she was a huge catalyst for making that transition a little easy for us in the beginning, because it was so different. And so I know, after we left the church, I was able to have a Facebook page and not have everything that I put on there screened by my husband. I was allowed to have a different opinion than him and be able to voice that, online, which wasn't allowed to before. And just that it was okay. And she had to kind of break down these different walls and the different teachings that we had sat under for so long, and be able to realize that, those roles look so much different now, and that it's not his duty to filter everything that I'm feeling and all my opinions through him and completely line up with him now. I am this separate person, but how do we make this work now, since it looks so different than what we were used to before? So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, but... It
does. I wish I had him sitting here now, because what I want to ask him is, as a man who came out of that, there is so much... You get so much extra.
Yes.
And so by stepping out and working to maintain the relationship you stepped out with, you forfeit things that you had before. And I'm just so curious about that from the male perspective. And I've had a couple conversations with some men, kind of offline. But yeah, I'd be curious. Have the two of you spoken about this?
Yeah, as you're saying that, one thing that comes to mind is in the beginning, he expressed a lot of feelings of guilt. Any choices that I made that he didn't agree with, he felt guilty that he wasn't keeping me in line with his beliefs with God. So, he still saw his relationship with God, that I had to fall in line with everything that he believed. And if I believed anything different, then he was doing something wrong. So he had all these feelings of guilt that he was constantly battling until he realized, I am my own person. I can have my own beliefs, and they don't have to be the same as his. And that he's not responsible for me, because there's so much of that was taught, of course, in the message that, the man's responsible for everything and for getting your wife to heaven. The man is responsible for making sure she is submitted and does all the right things in the household, and that, every belief and doctrine is followed to a T. he realized that he was no longer responsible for that. I think after the initial waves of guilt kind of left, I think there was a sense of freedom, I think, that came from that on his side. And I know I'm speaking for him, but he's expressed a couple of those things to me in the past. So
yeah, I would hope that is where a man would land is, whew, I can exhale.
Yes.
We're not that easy to keep in line. So to take some of that pressure off of, yeah, we as women are still accountable to God directly for our actions and our thoughts and behaviors and beliefs. And we have a direct relationship, just like men do. And we're to support one another to be the best that we can be.
Right.
So yeah, I would hope that would bring a sense of freedom. And I think the fact that it did speaks to the kind of man that you were married to already, because some men would not want to forfeit the control.
Sure. Yeah.
So applaud him for that.
Yes.
Because they're groomed to have it. And so I don't even say that to attack the men out there who would really struggle with it. They have been taught it starting at very young ages. It's not the easiest thing to just get rid of.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
How many years removed now are you? Not
15.
to give everyone your age. But
So 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
So being 7 years removed, what would you say still impacts you today in a negative way? What's still hard?
For sure, trusting people is huge, because I always find myself second guessing every relationship. Like, what's the hidden agenda? I think the biggest thing is I always feel like there's some like source of need of control on their end. Like, what are they trying to control in this relationship? So it's hard to silence those thoughts, because that's so much of what I experienced when we left the church. All these, what I thought were deep-seated friendships in the church, when we walked away, I realized we're so surface. We never talked about anything deep, because you weren't allowed to question anything. So it was always those relationships are just not very deep at all. And so, like, now that I'm forming new relationships, it's hard for me to be vulnerable, to allow myself to be put in that situation again where someone can hurt me. And so a lot of that trust is just very difficult to come by, just because I feel like there's always some agenda. Like, why would they want to be my friend? There has to be an agenda. There has to be some kind of controlling factor involved. And so it's very hard for me to step out from that and actually look at something positive.
I have this complicated mess of, do I trust them to actually stick around? And so in order for them to stick around, I have to perform.
Sure.
And so then I don't want to perform. And so then I don't put forth the effort that the person actually deserves. And so it's like this self-fulfilling thing then of, well, why would they stick around? I'm not putting anything into the relationship.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that's something that over the years I've become very aware of. I haven't totally solved it, but awareness is good, right?
Yes,
and then
the first step.
Yes. And then it's okay, being willing to take those risks. I'm curious, I'm going to give an example because I think this question would be hard without one. But for me, showing that I care about someone feels like vulnerability. So surprising someone with something or doing something thoughtful, that's an indication for me with my love language of I care about you. I was thinking of you. I made this effort to mail you something or whatever it may be. And so that's vulnerability. I'm curious, does that resonate for you?
It does. I know, like, for me, reaching out to someone, even by text or something, like if they don't respond, or are they only responding because, they feel obligated to, which I know isn't necessarily because of religion. Like a lot of that's just social anxiety too. But I know, like for myself, just so much of it is difficult to do because it's hard to, it just goes back to hard to trust, and that they have the best intentions, and that, like you said yourself, you almost are counterproductive because you're protecting yourself by doing things that aren't necessarily going to build the relationship, by having all these thoughts of like, why are they being nice to me? They're just being nice to me because they have to. And so yeah, relationships are hard.
And I mean, that's the impression we were given, is that they're being nice because they have to. Because if they really wanted to, then they wouldn't have just cut us off so fast. Mm-hmm. And now I'm not actually saying that I think that's 100% accurate, because I actually don't. I don't think it's 100% accurate. I think that the undue influence, the mind control, the indoctrination is so strong that the way people respond isn't necessarily fully congruent with how they want to act.
Sure.
So I do see a real distinction there. I think there are people who I've left behind, so to speak, in their minds, who wish that there was more communication. I think that they are hurting over the loss, and that they would have liked to have had it. But they really truly believe that their salvation even could be at stake if they did. And so I can understand that rationally. But generally, yeah, the impression that we are given is you would have stayed in touch if you really cared, if it had been genuine. It's hard to keep going back to, okay, but what's the truth of their situation, and kind of walk that through like I just did. I have to go back and walk that through again and remind myself that their actions maybe are not fully speaking to their heart position.
And on that note, like, I know when I was still in the message, like when people left, I responded the exact same way they're treating me. And so it's hard to judge, because you can come from a place of understanding and just realizing they're just doing self-preservation at this point. They feel like, they will go to hell if they reach out to me, because then what if they start doubting and then they start going down the same road? So yeah. And I think too, with like friendships now, I find myself almost on the flip side where, like, I realized so many of my relationships before in the church were just surface, that now I don't want surface relationships. I want those deep relationships. And so I find myself jumping in to friendships way too deep, too quickly. It's a good thing I'm married, because that would be a hard one to do. This is only the first date. Like, why are we having this deep conversation? And I find myself like, just wanting to have more meaningful conversations. But yet I know that takes time to get to that point and have trust from the other person. But yeah, that's kind of the flip side of that too.
Yeah. When I've done some of that as well. When I met my husband, when he finally suckered me into having a date with him, which took a minute, not because he wasn't lovely, but because
that sounds like a story in itself.
Just because I didn't want to date at that moment. I was so over it. But he told me his whole story. It was like an 1.5-hour monologue about his upbringing and all this stuff. And I'm like, what do I do with all this? And then by noon, he's like, are you my girlfriend? I'm like, what does that mean to you? So he definitely could resonate. He had a different upbringing, but goodness, it's really, again, something I kind of spoke to in the beginning was people can have different circumstances, but there's these overlaps of how we respond because of the emotional impact that we've gone through. And him having such a different story, there are still overlaps in our experience, how we've experienced things and struggles we've had out of that. So that's one where the two of you definitely would connect, even though he has a totally different story.
That's funny.
Yeah. Have you found anything positive from this experience as you've had some space between then and now?
Such a tricky question, because I want to say no, there's nothing positive that came out of it. Like, it was so hurtful. But, I mean, I wouldn't have met my husband if I hadn't gone through that. And that's like the one relationship where I'm just like, it was worth it to go through the heartache of losing every single friend you ever had, your whole social context, just being taken from you in a day. It was worth it because, I met my husband. Like you said, it's very strange for a man to come out of that religion just because it's so beneficial for the man to have all these rights and be so controlling. And I think another benefit of leaving the church that I've seen is there is more like emotional intelligence that comes out of surviving like incidents like that, and the experience that you have. You're just able to be more aware of what other people are going through, but then also more self-aware of yourself.
How has this history shaped you as a professional?
Well, I know when I started out, I went to college, which was very rare for a woman in the church, because like the church I grew up in, not even men were encouraged to go to college. And so the fact that a woman was doing it was just like, why? She should be staying at home and preparing to be a wife someday if she's not already. And so like professionally, I did go to college. I did get a degree, but I also left that profession because I was in the medical field. I was wearing scrubs in surgery and felt so condemned by the church that I was wearing pants and not a skirt 100% of the time. And so I ended up leaving that career because like I felt that I wasn't being the true Christian that I should have been by doing that. So that affected me quite a bit. And I think now, like, I do a lot of consulting, and so I'm able to, because of my past experience of being able to relate to people and see how they're responding could mean so many different things, that I'm able to consult people and their different difficulties that they're coming to the table with in a better way just because of that reason. Experiences that I had.
Wow. Had you ever considered going back to that career, or did it feel like you had moved on in a different direction? It just wasn't quite right anymore?
I mean, yes and no. I was an x-ray tech, and I let my license expire just because I didn't think I'd ever go back to it. And so there'd be a whole bunch of continuing education I have to get caught up on and licenses to pay for, and I don't even know if I have to go back to school for some of it. But I know for myself, at the time I worked at a hospital, and just the thought of going back to working weekends or the night shift and some of that just doesn't fit in my lifestyle now. So I don't think I'd go back. But,
So it sounds like it ultimately did work out okay. It's not an area that you regret necessarily.
No, I mean, I regret in the sense that I wouldn't have made that choice hadn't I been in the church, and I could have been very fulfilled. But the fact that there was so much condemnation coming across the pulpit for what I was doing, and just being scared of running into someone from church while I was at work, there was just so much fear and anxiety from that job that I eventually just had to stop because I felt like, I wasn't being a good Christian, or someday I was going to get caught and be so embarrassed. So that's the only regret, is that I think I probably would have still been doing it had it not been for the church.
Wow. How has this history shaped you relationally as a wife?
That was a hard question. Like, even like when I saw it printed out that you had given it to me, I was like, I don't know how to answer this one.
I think one question I'd have for you, one way I would think of this is, just lost my train of thought of how I was going to say it. Like, it seems like you would have a strength in you that someone else may not have, or may not have to the degree that you do at this point, because you went from not having something to having something. You went from not having the freedom to be you, to be a genuine Jennifer, to having the opportunity to figure out what does that mean and to begin to step into it. And there's something about that process that I've found is very, I would say, empowering, but in a more subtle and kind of calm, peaceful way for women that I've had the honor of speaking with.
Yeah, when you ask that question, I think for myself, like in the relation of being a wife, I feel like I've stepped back so much from I don't know, because I feel like our relationship is so different because of what we experienced, that he does allow so much freedom for me, that there's no judgment anymore. Anything that I want to do and pursue, I feel like would be supported, just because he knows that the opposite of that was what he was taught. And so I think for myself as a wife, it's a balance of being my own person, but then also supporting our relationship together in whatever way that might look like. But I know for me, it's very contentious at times, because even when I want to support Jeremy in something, I find myself fighting that, just because, like, this is what I've always done. This is what I was taught to do. And so how can I, like, fight this? And I find myself being, like, contentious in that moment. And so sometimes like trying to be one with goals and with ideas and with life, I find myself fighting that, just because I want to prove that I am myself, my person, even though it's not wrong to do that together as a team. It's very hard for me to be a team player, just because I don't want to be anything close to what I was raised to be.
Yeah, it sounds like this need to assert yourself at times maybe actually isn't even in alignment with your own goals.
Like, yeah, I don't even want to be that way, but yet I find myself drawn to that, just because, like, in no way do I ever want to be submissive again.
Right. There's such an aversion to that. That it can be very triggering. Sure. We could be very, like, ultra sensitive to just sensing that. Mm-hmm. And I know I've had to step back many times and ask myself, what do I actually even want here? Because I feel like I'm still responding to my upbringing, and I don't want to be.
Right.
It's still influencing me in some way, and I don't want that to be the case. So how do I respond to this differently? And yeah, it pops back up for sure.
It does.
If you were to issue your loved ones a warning in hopes of them never finding themselves in a similar situation, which red flag would you want them to be aware of?
I know for, like, joining cults or being anywhere close to that kind of community, just the red flag that I've realized is that any community that says you need Jesus plus this other thing should be an indication that something's wrong. You should never need anything more than just the Bible or anything more than just your relationship with Christ. Anything that's added to that, or any other person who would come in between you and Christ as this interpreter of God to you should be a red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. Usually I have that as the last question, but I want to ask if you'd share a little bit about Casting Pearls and what your heart is for that work.
Yeah, so that was interesting because when I was in Toledo, I got to work with Salvation Army with some of the victims that had left trafficking. And at the time I was a photographer in the area, had my own business. And I kind of partnered with that organization just to give women some more like self-confidence. So some of these women, were trying to get back out into the workforce and, or trying to restart their lives over. And I was like, how awesome would it be to bring in a makeup artist, and we brought in professional hairstylists, and they were allowed to pick out a professional outfit from like this boutique store. And we created this whole day where we're just like reinventing these women to be who they wanted to be and how they wanted the world to see them. And then I would come in and take their portrait. That way they could update their resume and just kind of put their best foot forward, and kind of give them confidence. And so I realized through that work that I was volunteering that like, wow, I love working with women. And like, it was so healing for me just to watch the transformation that they were going through as well. And to see them cry, and they see their own photo brought up, like, that's me, like, no way. Like, I never thought I could look, this way. And so that was just an incredible experience. And so my husband and I then got a job traveling full time on the road for 3 years. So we sold our house in Toledo. And as I was traveling, I was like, how can I continue this work where I get to work with women? Because I really feel passionate about that. Because I know for myself, self-confidence was so hard to come by when you're constantly degraded and put down. And so I wanted to really be able to help women. And so I just realized that I'm learning to have a voice for myself. How can I create a platform where women can also have their own voice? And at the time, there was only a handful of websites against our prophet's teachings. And so there was nothing really dedicated just for women. And so I created a website, Casting Pearls. Comes from the scripture of do not cast your pearls before swine. And so I felt like we were women that God created, and yet we were cast before this prophet to put us down and tell us we were not worthy and not worth anything. And this website now allows women to share their story, and then also at the same time just kind of give information out about some of the erroneous teachings regarding women. And as I traveled for work, I was able to go to all these different cities throughout the U.S. And because this is such a worldwide cult religion, I was able to meet almost a woman from every city we were at, or if not close by. And so women were reaching out to me through different groups and saying, hey, I want to be a part of this project. I wanted to share their experience. That way they could help other women that wanted to leave be like, yeah, that's a similar situation I'm in. And to be able to see that women were able to overcome different circumstances in their life. And so that's kind of how the project came together. And I was very blessed to be a part of it and be able to, I think, just give women a voice where we didn't have one before. And so it's hard to speak up for yourself, but when you feel like you're in a group speaking your collective voice together, it becomes so much more louder. And it's so hard to ignore when there's not just one story, but it's several stories that are coming together. And this was a shared, similar experience we all went through.
That's powerful. Are you still active with the project, or is the project considered complete?
It's pretty much at a standstill now that we're not traveling anymore, just because I'm not out meeting these women face to face as I'm going through their city. But I've had a couple reach out to me that still wanting to share their story, but because of COVID and different reasons, they haven't been able to get their photo to me to go along with their story, or to really sit down and kind of actually write it out. So I do have two, I think, that still want to add to my current story, but I'm not active as far as like seeking women out to see if they'd be interested in sharing. But I still find quite a bit of volume that still go to the website, and so it's still being seen and looked at and scrolled through, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, it's an incredible resource for women. So that's why I was wondering if it was complete or not. Even as a completed site, I'd highly recommend that any woman listening go and check it out, because again, you could see it's been a lot of work that's gone into it, a lot of heart, many women's hearts and souls that have gone into it. And so for any woman who's listening, who has struggled and is feeling isolated, it's a great resource. So we will absolutely link that in the show notes for anyone to go check out.
Yeah. I just love that there's a positive to the end of all these stories. Like, yes, some of these women went through horrendous things that no one should ever go through, but yet at the end, you can see where they are today, how they've come into their own self, and how they're able to live a very edifying and joyful life despite what they've been through. So that's, to me, was so encouraging, that any woman that will look at it and still be in the same situation, that they used to be in, like, I want them to feel encouraged that it's not the end of the road. There's still, the pursuit of being who you're meant to be, and to actually remove yourself from those situations, and there is hope.